us, and also to those who are watching the live stream after a provocative first session of our conference on the discursive turn in copyright. We are refreshed after our break and ready for an equally provocative second session with Professor Betsy Rosenblatt, who is our neighbor down the road here in Orange County at Whittier Law School. And again, I'll refer you to the website or to your program for her very extensive and impressive list of accomplishments. We'll hear from her for about 20 minutes presenting her paper. And then her commentator will be Joseph Jenkins, who is our neighbor literally upstairs in this building here at UCI, who has taught also for the law school as well as for our colleagues in the Department of Education. We'll hear from him for about 15 minutes and then again go into questions. Professor Rosenblatt.
Thank you. I could not be more pleased to be part of this array of scholars. This is exactly who I always dreamed of being associated with, and poof, here I am. So this project zooms out from Laura's to consider the role of fair use rather than just one factor in copyright's discourse of value. And so I'll begin by talking about what this discourse of value is, what I mean by it, and then consider the role of fair use doctrine and of engaging in fair use in what I see as this hierarchy that copyright law has baked in. Throughout, I'm referring to the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, literary theorist, and feminist scholars who have updated and refined his theory and theories, which postulate that all expression exists in an ecosystem of dialogue. Every speaker communicates by responding to other communications, bringing their own meanings to the words and forms that others have expressed before them, and thus all expression is in relation to other expression. Its meaning coming not only from the speaker, and not only from the reader or hearer, but also from context. My work continues in the vein of scholars like Rosemary Coombe and Karis Craig, who consider the way in which copyright law is part of a larger discourse of power and relationships between people. And from there, I draw a conclusion that copyright law gives certain people power over tools of communication and thus gives them power over others who engage in expression. And that this power is hierarchical in nature. Example, copyright assigns ownership to only some who engage in expression. It deems some speakers original, that is to say, the originator of a work. This person is an author, a creator, or a mastermind, and their expressions are deemed ownable and something from which they can profit. Even more than that, the implication of that decision is that their work promotes progress, because we wouldn't give protection to work that didn't promote progress. The Constitution tells us that we give protection to work for the purpose of promoting progress. Below that person on the hierarchy is a derivative speaker of some sort, a person who copies. Maybe they infringe, maybe they recreate based on other work, maybe they're engaged in fair use, but they are building upon the work of others. Never mind that, of course, this is true even of originators. This person, whose work is recognizably derived from another's, gains more limited protection. A creator whose work is infringingly derived from another's, an assessment that will depend on questions of similarity and fair use, as I'll talk about in a moment, as well as from a consumer's ability to parse out one contributor's contribution from another, that person gains no protection at all if they're infringing. Down below, that deriver is an audience, a consumer who the law views as having no role in the making of meaning, although I think, as we all recognize, that is a fiction at best. Even if there is recognition of the consumer's meaning making, it's not afforded any value by copyright. There are, of course, reasons for these rules. They're not arbitrary. Any system, copyright is a hallmark system that is predicated on giving authors exclusive market power, has to distinguish in some way between authors and non-authors, and needs some way to define the scope of that market exclusivity afforded. So these aren't purely arbitrary rules, but they are certainly artificial ones, and they ignore the relational nature of communication. So here I make my first turn into Bakhtin, who observes the relational nature of communication, explaining that all creative expression is part of a web of discourse that connects speakers and hearers, all meaning, therefore, being derived from a combination of the self and the other. Later scholars have complicated this in ways that I find particularly useful by discussing how meaning is created not only by a combination of the self and the other, but by a combination of the self, the other, and context. So meaning emerges from a creator's choices, a hearer's expectations, and social and cultural context, and authorship is therefore always both derivative and original. And if we reframe creation this way, original could mean something very different from what copyright means by original. Copyright law tells us that in order to be original, a work must originate from an author. Well, in a relational interpretation of creation, nothing originates from an author, but an author definitely does something important. An author contextualizes or recontextualizes what came before. With this move, the creator-consumer dichotomy becomes false, but the role of the creator is no less original. It's original only in the sense that it contributes certain decisions to meaning. So I suggest that this communicative work, and here I'm using work partly in the verb sense of work and partly in the noun sense of work, can itself be an act of resistance to this hierarchy. And it can be an act of resistance that's independent to whatever message its content holds. How do I get there? Well, a work that engages in explicit re-expression can act as overt resistance to copyright's originality definition and the hierarchy inherent in that definition, at least temporarily, by elevating the derivative speaker, the speaker who acknowledges their debt to what came before, to the status of originator. Thus, acts of overtly derivative creation can be a political act of resistance to copyright's proprietary structures. I also suggest, and here I turn again to Bakhtin, that fair use doctrine creates a Carnivalesque framework for these acts of expressive resistance, a framework that may temporarily upturn copyright law's hierarchy of value, but implicitly reflects and reinforces existing power structures. Let me explain where Bakhtin fits into this. Bakhtin developed the theory of the Carnivalesque to describe the historical development of humorous, grotesque, or unexpected elements in the literary form of the novel. His theory was pretty specific, but it expanded out, and it's rooted in Bakhtin's own historically dubious but theoretically instructive conception of medieval European culture, in which the folk, that is to say the ordinary people of the day, lived under strict, often church authority, but were given opportunities to let off steam through officially sanctioned revels, such as pageants or festivals or parodies. Carnival, in this structure, created a temporary space for fantasy, radicalism, and criticism of the upper strata, frequently church authorities. But Carnival did not undermine the persistent power of those authorities or distort the larger framework of class and political structure. In fact, it perpetuated those hierarchies by, among other things, creating a pressure valve that let participants rebel without engaging in open revolt. I suggest that fair use, we could conceive of fair use by analogy to the Carnivalesque. Like the Carnivalesque, fair uses employ the communicative tools of the establishment to convey a new, possibly contradictory meaning, forming a sort of secular use of sacred symbols. Like Carnival, fair use entails permission from authority to repurpose those symbols, but only within certain authority-defined parameters. And commonly recognized fair uses, such as criticism, or parody, or satire, or data mining, or collage, or scholarship, something we all engage in, are overtly derivative endeavors that exist within this framework. They all involve expression by a non-owner using the language of the owner with a purpose or meaning different from what the owner intended, we think. They invert the power hierarchy then by recognizing that all expression, whether the law defines it as original or derived, depends on what came before, and that a single expression can carry multiple meanings, something that the hierarchy of value of copyright does not acknowledge outside the fair use context. Fair use also gives the derived creator a right to utter the last word, or I would say the next word, over the possible objections of the original creator. But it does this only within specific doctrinal boundaries. It encloses the relational nature of expression, just as the Carnival enclosed its challenges to authority within specific temporal boundaries. How does it do this? Well, fair use favors certain kinds of expression and certain ways of expressing. It favors expression that criticizes or comments upon the original work. It favors expression that is non-commercial. It favors expression that uses small rather than large amounts of the original. It favors expression that incorporates factual rather than fictional works. And in those ways, it shapes what this resistance can constitute. Also, because the fair use analysis depends on weighing often deeply subjective factors, people who engage in fair use take on higher uncertainty than those who can claim originality. A fact that favors established, well-resourced derivers more than it favors less privileged or less mainstream derivers. Also, the very hierarchy that we began with, the contours of this definition of originality, place derivative creators in a position that will forever be subsidiary, both legally and morally, to the authors whose works they have relied upon. The discourse of fair use as use of someone else's work places fair users on the wrong side of a moral equation, as Karis Craig has said, and allows the author of the underlying work to justify belittling the fair user as crude, unskilled, uncreative, or parasitic. That is to say, even though the law permits fair uses, it does so with a judgmental tone. And yet, fair use is still regarded as among copyright law's chief safeguards of free expression. I argue that this very perception may compromise freedom of speech by creating a facade of freedom that dulls the incentive for creators to engage in more radical opposition to exclusivity-based protection and to the very hierarchical concepts that underlie our understanding of copyright and creation. Having recognized the necessity of derivative creation to promote progress, copyright law circumscribes that derivative creation within a hierarchical framework, but it need not. The availability of fair use as licensed resistance to hierarchy places everyday fair users in the mainstream, downplays the political potential of fair users' implicit and often unintended challenges to authority, further marginalizes more radical acts of copying, such as peer-to-peer file sharing and counterfeiting, and justifies more severe penalties and more intrusive techniques for detecting infringement. But it need not. Likewise, to the extent that derivers' works recode the work of copyright owners, fair use doctrine serves the interests of the owners by maintaining their upper hand, not only in copyright's discourse of value, but also in the practical sense of imposing uncertainties and expenses on those downstream recoders. And it acts as a safety valve that keeps the metaphorical peasants from rioting. So while fair use activity does permit creators to engage with dominant culture, may provide social or economic mobility for creators, it does little to chip away at the narrative of value that copyright law has baked in. Those who create derivatively without relying on fair use principles must be well-resourced enough to pay and must be willing to accept content restrictions placed on them by copyright holders. Those who instead rely on fair use to advance themselves as creators must also make decisions based on this restrictive framework of fair use law. They must shift to a different mode of creation if they want commercial benefit from their work, or they're stuck being forever deemed derivative or makers of lower art. Where do I come out on all this? Right. So I've described a world that is perhaps hierarchical, but we all live in hierarchical worlds all the time. What do we do about this? Well, I don't know. Right? I'm not here to solve the problem. I'm just here to identify it. I do know, and I think I want us all to agree that fair use is an essential element of copyright law. Right? It's good. It's needed to promote discourse. Much as the carnival, as Bakhtin conceived it, was an essential element of medieval European life. But through the lens of the Carnivalesque, I think we can observe the potentially harmful and artificial value judgments that hide within the fair use framework. And perhaps by foregrounding these value judgments, we can understand their impact on legal discourse, and we can start to chip away at our assumptions about what work is and what expressive work is. And with that, I'll leave you to ponder how we might operationalize that.
Thank you. Professor Jenkins.
Sound okay? Thank you, Dan and UCI Law, for your kind invitation. The title of our conference today refers to a discursive turn, and it is fitting that Betsy Rosenblatt's paper focuses on Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin considers dialogics as the crucial form of the modern novel. One entire language or conventional way of speaking, including the worldview implicit in it, approached and provoked from the perspective of another. We may be in the midst of Bakhtinian dialogics right here in this room. This is a meeting of disciplines, each under the sway of different genre conventions. One relates to law schools, the Law Review article, which I tend to see from the distance of the humanities as responding to a kind of social science convention, backed also, of course, by a more ancient pedigree in common law. Under this convention, a series of propositions, each backed by citation to collected facts and recognized authority, is arranged in the manner of logical deduction. I know this is not an ironclad rule, however, Betsy's paper conforms to this convention. It is a fine and well-crafted example. Humanities critical theory responds to different conventions. Certainly from commercial lawyering's point of view, and some of this seeps into law schools as well, critical theory complicates and far too much. I remember my first year right out of Berkeley. I was a new associate in a big law firm, and at some point a third year, a bit too old to be an associate, started dropping by my office. At first I thought these were kindly social calls from someone higher up on the totem pole. He'd ask what I was working on and then stroke his beard and wax philosophically, recalling in too great detail the treatises that dealt with what he called somewhat related matters. Then when he was done, half hour or so, he'd ask me the name of the client and bill for the time, which of course did not please the partner in charge of invoicing that client. Needless to say, this third-year associate soon disappeared. Complication is not prized by lawyers looking for tangible near-term results. But that's not the convention in some other places. 10 years after that, I'm the little guy again, first-year grad student, comp lit, UCLA. I'm doing all I can to get some grip on these impossible theory books they're telling us to read. And whenever I'd finally work up the nerve to say something in class, some snooty fourth-year student would stick up his nose and say, well, we might want to complicate that. It always made me think of that billing partner back at my old firm. And now more time rolls by, and you invite me here pretty much to be the humanities theories guy, the complicator. And I don't want to sound like an arrogant jerk like those fourth-year students in grad school. I also admit without hesitation that you'll never get near-term tangible results by speaking the language of critical theory. It's only in the long term, if we ever get there, that thinking discursively might help somewhat in understanding plays of potentiality lurking behind what we say. In short, my Bakhtin, he just happens to be mine since I come at him now through Walter Benjamin, Giorgio Agamben, Hans Blumenberg, and some others. My Bakhtin I can only touch on lightly. It's hard to pry him into the logic-based conventions of the Law Review article. Even analogy, the thing you do in law with precedents, presses too hard on Bakhtin. Yes, at times he resorts to analogy, but he is most compelling when he relates historical moments distant in time and space, neither by analogy nor contiguity, neither by metaphor nor metonymy. Complicated, no? And who the hell's got time for this? So I'll just say a few short things and then sit down. Bakhtin is influential in literary circles for his theory of the novel. He traces what he calls the prehistory of the novel, back beyond classical Greece. He also gives special importance to Hellenic culture's spread, including its interactions with Roman conquest. Languages and cultures interact. Experience is gained in seeing and thinking the world through more than one language. This facilitates perception and expression of particular language styles. And once you have an image of a language as a whole, you perceive, at least implicitly, the gap between any one language and the things outside language it tries to convey. This is an important intuition, crucial to political resistance. It renders the worldview of a particular language merely conditional. However, in the ancient Roman world, according to Bakhtin, these dialogics I've just described are still scattered about. Parody and travesty of different ways of life, of speaking, appear in various genres of the time and in everyday life. They haven't yet cohered into a single genre. This is the prehistory of the novel. Still, Bakhtin maintains that this Roman sense of humor is a larger contribution to Western cultures than Roman law. But something has to happen before all this parody and travesty can congeal into the form of the modern novel. What happens is the rise of philology, study of ancient texts, etc., developing in the Renaissance. This part is well known and easy to understand because we live still in cultures well indebted to Greek and Roman classical texts, even if many people today do not know their names. What Bakhtin adds is that certain great Renaissance texts, Rabelais, Cervantes, and Shakespeare, for example, were written directly exposed to the grotesque realism of medieval Carnival, which is itself indebted to that Roman sense of humor. This is an exposure that later writers, including those concerned with fair use exceptions and their masters, I might add, cannot have lived directly. Later cultures have no direct experience with the Carnivalesque because it has been weakened and degraded in modernity, notably by the individualism that arises in the Renaissance. The Carnivalesque for Bakhtin is a language, a way of speaking with a worldview attached. It interacts with other languages. It also responds to differing historical circumstances. Certainly, the Renaissance brought great changes, but Bakhtin describes as well a more ancient moment related to what he calls the grotesque realism of the Carnivalesque. He traces it back to prehistoric moments where a tribe enacts not only solemn religious rites, beseeching respectfully what it needs to survive, but also humiliates its god. The comic and the solemn are equally sacred. Later, in the early Christian era, clerics accommodated pagans, lining up Christian holidays with traditional feast days, and they also had to tolerate the earthy humor of their rustic flocks, progeny of those God-humiliating tribes. 1,000 years goes by, and clergy still not only tolerate but engage themselves in witty Latin verses, vulgar dialogics, like describing their needs to fill their bellies and empty their bowels in the Latin of the church. The clergy enjoyed this, even those decidedly not rustic. Also, there occurred a kind of unconcealment, inaccessible to those who see the world through a single language lens. Dialogical parody, including the Carnivalesque, intuits the conditionality of supposedly unconditional truths implied by particular language conventions. Bakhtin uses the word indestructible to describe this medieval grotesque realism. It includes not only town market speech, but also the Latin parodies I've just mentioned. Rabelais, Cervantes, and Shakespeare are exposed directly to grotesque realism. At that time, its degradation in modernity is just beginning. Yet even in modernity, the carnivalesque impulse does not disappear. Rather, it is repressed by other discourses under changing circumstances. Bakhtin uses the term potentialities in describing these movements of appearance and repression. This is a term much used today by critical theory in the tradition of Walter Benjamin and Giorgio Agamben. You could also mention Freud and Lacan. It's not that the powerful grant permission for the carnivalesque to appear. It is rather that the potentiality of the dominant language, along with the value hierarchy presupposed by it, is itself constituted by other potentialities, even those repressed, with which it interacts. For example, the bloody dictator decides his next move based on worried reads of street crowd noise, or even a duly elected president consults opinion polls while deciding on the words for an upcoming speech. In modernity, according to Bakhtin, meanings that once attached to the carnivalesque become inaccessible. We today can't read Rabelais as his early readers did because the redemptive impulse of Rabelais' grotesque realism is almost lost. It is nearly made incomprehensible by individualistic presuppositions with us in various forms since the Renaissance. But we can take a stab at comprehending it. Bakhtin underlines that the carnivalesque is nearly incomprehensible. What is repressed or canceled insists on return. So here's the stab. We can understand intellectually that the medieval carnivalesque redeems each mortal death, seeing each person as a part of a greater human mass. Each death fertilizes some new birth and takes it laughingly. Change is the essence, metamorphosis. Here is where Bakhtin comes close to accepting an unconditional truth. Ancient laughing hags with pregnant bellies, which we may have trouble relating to, as opposed to Michelangelo's statue of David, represented as complete unto himself, serenely independent of his surroundings, individualized. I've got to stop here since time is moving on. Before you know it, David's rump is wrinkled and he's starting to get a paunch. If I had some more time, I'd try to relate Bakhtin to copyright's kowtow to originality, which Betsy's paper ably critiques through a different convention. One of the most important points Betsy makes is that fair use is shadowed by low moral status because of its treatment as a mere exception, neighbored by pirates under current law. I would add something, but of course it would be annoyingly complicated. I juxtapose what copyright calls original with what Benjamin calls originary. This marks a play of potentialities that is readable as well in Bakhtin's writings, the one writing under Hitler, the other under Stalin, maybe complication was a try for self-protection. What I might say would have something to do with authority granted to tradition as opposed to innovation, what is old versus what is new, redemptive grace controlled by the forebear versus controlled by the follower. This involves a puzzle that's been with us ever since Jacob wrestled with the angel. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, Joseph, please don't go too far. Betsy, perhaps you'd like to respond to a couple of points, and then we'll have some time available for questions.
Well, Joseph, you've succeeded in complicating quite poetically, and I really appreciate the beautiful way in which you've articulated these complications, and particularly the reference to potentialities, which I think is something I hadn't thought a great deal about, and would like to explore more in this piece. It brings to mind there was a sort of gesture to Foucault in the paper that talks about how maybe this isn't about the powerful granting permission, but really is about the function of a hierarchy itself as power. And that in that sense, the potentiality of the folk is that sort of resistance by the folk is actually an inherent part of the system, this sort of underbubbling of a different sort of power. And that's something that, you're right, is complicating and perhaps more complicating than the law review format would want, but is definitely worth thinking more about and discussing it. So I appreciate it very much.
So I've got to sort of exercise my moderator's prerogative here, and I'm going to throw out the first question for Betsy, and maybe Joseph would like to jump in as well. As I hear the presentations and look at the paper, of course, Carnivalesque is closely related to the figure of the harlequin or the fool, the joker, and you can very quickly get into other cultures, the trickster, and then thinking about some things that Joseph said and more about Kavita Phillips' work, really. That makes me wonder how in your paper, how in your theory, what I think in copyright may be the modern figure of the pirate, or sometimes the hacker, plays into this power dynamic and the resistance that you're talking about. Debbie Halperner's thought about this a little bit. John Logie has thought about this a little bit. But that icon or that figure of the pirate, how that translates and how that plays against the theories that you're working with.
Here, I think I might move from Bakhtin to Agamben, in the sense that I think that if fair use is play that sacralizes, then piracy is profaning, and so the pirate or the hacker may not be so much the trickster or the harlequin as the villain in this framework. Although we might, and I think this framework actually may further marginalize the pirate or the hacker beyond what would be necessary in a more sort of more sort of dialogic reading of what actually happens in communication. But that may be too radical for me to say, and so perhaps I don't need to be quite so bold.
Joseph, any thoughts on that? I think Kavita Phillips has some thoughts as well.
No.
I'll come back to Joseph,
Yeah, please do.
because I love that sentence at the end where you said, alongside fair use, I'm going to put the figure of the pirate. So I will hand this over to you to talk about that. But I'll use Joseph back to Betsy, where Joseph began with the problem of reading by analogy, which is, I think, what you just did, right? If X is sacralizing, then Y is profaning.
Certainly.
And I'm not sure that we can read the pirate through analogy. And I alluded to that as a critique of a discourse which I myself have been part of, this first, second, and third waves of pirate studies. I do think in my 2005 piece, which I think is what you're referring to, that I participated, perhaps unknowingly, in the kind of analogizing of the pirate with what I'm now calling critically the kind of standpoint figure. This problem of standpoint epistemology, where this figure becomes an emblem, whether it's proletarian subjects or marginalized subjects of low bandwidth varieties, right? It's both problematic and historically understandable. And there I would push against Joseph's, I think, strong historically relativist point, of course, undergirded by an actual historical claim of Renaissance individualism, which is Foucault's claim in The Invention of Man. However, I think these modes of the carnivalesque, the medieval grotesque, live on. Not to relativize other cultures, that's a horrible move, but to say they have the medieval. But you do see all kinds of modes of the carnivalesque in, say, South Indian theater. To bring up a specific example, Susan Siza has a great book on theater and how it performs the medieval, a despised form even in its own cultural context, right? And so I do see pirate studies in the Third World as taking up the figure in a kind of carnivalesque manner, which isn't quite the analogy. You made us the villain and now we're the heroes of our own narrative. It doesn't quite work that way. It is, I think, a genuinely carnivalesque pushing against and with power. And they make the exact same argument you made about the originary, about romantic divine grace being propounded in a kind of copyright doctrine, that they take great glee in breaking in very obvious and dramatic and messy ways. So I'll turn it back to you to ask you what you meant by that, putting them beside each other.
Joseph, please.
What specifically, what I meant by what?
When you said that there was a sentence where alongside fair use I will put the figure of the pirate.
No,
that's what I did.
I think I said Betsy did
That's
that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I enjoyed your comment earlier, saying that Laura is being radical here, and I thought that it is pretty radical in terms of the of taking intent out of the subject of law. And a lot of the conversation during the first session about reader response, and that's all, it actually makes me feel good because I'm even more radical. And I'm putting into question redemption given by the forebear rather than the follower, right? So the follower would be not I wouldn't call them the consumer, I would call them Jacob-like struggling against the law imposed by the forebear, right? And my work's in political theology and inheritance law, which I see relate. I guess that's why I'm invited. But we're breaking away even huger presuppositions when we place as conditional the entire legal structure, the socio-legal structure, right, which is put into place by patriarchs who are projecting with this idea of the omnipotent God into themselves and feeling good about it, making these laws that always put priority in themselves and try to make themselves into heroic figures. And it's Freudian in the end. But so is most of popular culture today, so I don't feel too bad about it.
Betsy, yeah.
I want to jump in there because I think I don't mean to be putting the pirate adjacent to the fair user, but I think that the position of the fair use doctrine in copyright discourse does precisely that. And I don't like that because I think, as you point out, the pirate is a much more complicated figure. And I love your use of the word glee in connection with piracy, because I think that there are significant sort of cultural elements for whom piracy is precisely a form of gleeful resistance to authority structures and of pushing back to those authority structures. Whether it's heroic or not, we can debate, but certainly that's part of their self-conception. And so I think perhaps that's one of my objections to what fair use is doing, is that it doesn't acknowledge the more complicated and occasionally valorous role of pirates.
Zar Saeed.
Thanks. So this is an extremely interesting project, and I have a question for you and then an extremely mundane comment. The question's going to be fascinating and not mundane, though. It's going to be brilliant. I'm joking. Okay. The question is in the tenor of Kavita's intervention and thinking about low bandwidth and is it high bandwidth or, okay, wide width? I find myself when I'm talking to artists and trying to communicate about fair use, always struck by how many cases are, and this makes sense from a real world perspective, but how many cases are brought by the likes of Google, and how do you talk to people who can't afford rent, about fair use, when they can't, there's no counsel, I'm not, by the way, making the suggestion that all artists, are penniless or something like that, but right, there's actually a kind of corporatization within fair use where you can launch a 10-year campaign and make something a fair use, right? So one of my questions for you about this project is, where is that in the story of the Carnivalesque? Are you assuming certain things about how fair use works? And who's the church? I understand that the first level of reading is law, but I sort of look at that and I think, well, Google kind of made itself a church of sorts. And then my quick and mundane comment, and I'll just hand this off, is when I think about anything grotesque in copyright, my first thought is damages. And that sounds like it's a joke, but actually, I think it would be fascinating to look at the Carnivalesque through, and I'm obsessed with juries at the moment, but through the lens of the jury. What happens when the jury goes off and does things? And their treatment of statutory damages is at times Carnivalesque.
Right. Yes. Is there anything more grotesque than the Thomas Rasset verdict? Right. Back to piracy. So I try in the paper to sort of talk about how the uncertainty aspect and the fact-based nature of fair use ends up sort of meaning that fair use favors overdogs, like Google, who end up making the law. But you're absolutely right that there's a point at which the analogy breaks down. I think, right, if the church is the patriarchy, Google is another church. Right? It's just trying to change things, and maybe not in a way that benefits the folk, in any way other than indirect effects.
James Nesbitt from UCI.
Thanks to everyone for fascinating papers so far. As an art historian, I work with, in a practical sense, getting publishing permissions for the images that I want to include in my publications. But I have to say, this is all very new to me in terms of the cutting edge issues in copyright law and intellectual property. In dialogue with that, things have felt a little bit, and admittedly we're about a third of the way through the day only, but they've felt a little bit like a time warp from a humanities perspective, in that we have Fish, Ezer, Benjamin, Bakhtin, to a lesser extent Agamben, taking us back maybe to the late 20th century in thinking through issues in the second decade of the 21st century. And so I'm just wondering, as a general question to maybe either of you or both of you, if you have any thoughts about what's motivating this particular dialogue of critical theories and contemporary issues in the law.
I think legal theory has a lot of catching up to do. We're still in the sort of mid-20th century with economics, too. Okay, that's perhaps a very radical thing for me to say, but I think just legal scholarship is behind.
So when I got started in teaching, one of my mentors said to me, "Dan, do you want to be a famous law professor?" And I said, "Sure, that'd be great." He goes, "Find something that was cutting edge in another field 30 years ago, bring it to law, and that will be, the cutting edge in law." So that may be what's happening. But we may have cutting up to do, some catching up to do. Yes, Ellen Burt from UCI.
Yeah, so I'm really a literary critic, and I'm coming at things from that direction. But I was wondering about your claim in your very fascinating paper and your response, which is that the original is kind of forever placed in the position, the top position, with the parody kind of coming after. If I look at, you were displacing that by way of a reference to this sort of originary Carnivalesque, but there's another way you could go at it. You could say that what's taking place, let's say, in the 19th century, when, by way of Benjamin, we learn that translation and reproduction are becoming the center of the modern work of art. One of the authors that I've worked on, Baudelaire, made his name as a translator of Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe is, I think, with great, for good reasons, a much better author to read in French than he is in English. Same is true of De Quincey. So there's a kind of strong move, at least in the poetic field, to lay a claim for the parody, as in fact having a right of city over the original. So I'd like to hear your response.
Well, I'd pull that into pop culture, which is that I think right now we're because I pull everything in pop culture. Right now Dan's like, yeah, she does. We're living in an era where, everybody knows Airplane, but nobody knows Zero Hour. Everybody knows blockbuster movies, but probably doesn't know the comics they're based on. So I think you're absolutely right that when we think about what is sort of framing our culture right now, be it high culture or popular culture, we're seeing translation and adaptation as the mode. But we're also seeing that as a matter of law, all those translators and adapters are constrained by the need to pay and get permission, and the Baudelaires of the world need to get permission from the Poes of the world to be the makers of cultural meaning. And so I think that's part of my critique.
Joseph?
I want to laud Betsy for an important point in her paper that I hope gets more attention. We're talking about pirates. Maybe the dark money described by Jane Mayer are the pirates, and these are attacks on free expression, not through government action, but through private parties that don't even say their names when they're doing it. Betsy also brought up the uncertainty involved in the fair use question. And if we want to turn things around a little bit, Laura, on reader response theory, I wonder at least, and the whole thing I've just told you how I criticize from a wide standpoint, but if we're stuck with the subject of intent and individual responsibility in law, then don't we need to run that all back through the fair user when the fair user is creating their work for their intent to be that it be readable as transformational by not only mainstream reader groups but other groups as well.
Anne-Marie Brighty?
Yeah, so
Betsy, it's interesting to hear you sort of talk about fair use as kind of a tool of oppression, and it's an interesting perspective for those of us who really love it. And so I'm just thinking about sort of the notion that fair use has a kind of taint about it. And then it makes me think of the Lenz versus Universal case, right? And this ambivalence in copyright law about whether fair use is an affirmative defense that excuses a bad culpable act, or whether fair use is actually an affirmative right that we have, right? Because the face of the statute says it is not an infringement of copyright, and yet for ages we have treated fair use as if it's an affirmative defense to a bad act. And so I'm wondering about that tension that is kind of inherent in the doctrine, and I'm wondering if maybe there isn't good news in the fact that the Ninth Circuit in Lenz actually decided to take this on and say, you know what, it's time for us to stop thinking about fair use as an affirmative defense, because really, it is it's not an infringement of copyright. And the stakes of that are kind of huge, both sort of culturally but also legally, I think.
Can I just actually add, I had a very small point, but it just, it's not worth a separate question, which is just this, the use of the word fair, right, in fair use, right? It'd be way too cute for your project to treat it as a noun, right, and associate it with the Carnivalesque. But the idea, but we sort of glide past the description of it as fair use, right? And that carries some meaning that maybe we want to resist, right? The idea that the use has to be fair, because what you were talking about are a lot of unfair uses, right? And so it's just interesting to think about if that word is actually doing any meaning, doing any work at all anymore.
So Right, it's funny that you're right that it's sort of fascinating that I'm talking about fair use as a tool of oppression when my sort of whole bread and butter is promoting fair use. And I think it's also maybe a little bit ironic that here's part of the purpose of this paper is to complicate how we think of fair use, even though it's certainly not complicating in the law review format. But here's my thought about Lens versus Universal. Lens versus Universal came to the conclusion, and I think it's both correct and good news, that it came to the conclusion that fair use is wholly authorized by the law rather than merely excused by the law. But the kid who was dancing to that Prince video in Lens versus Universal is in junior high school now. And Stephanie Lens's life has been consumed by litigation over this. So while the court said fair use is wholly authorized by the law, Stephanie Lens is still oppressed by the system of fair use that has justified her act. So I think that's where I'd go with it.
Quick follow-up by Simon Stern.
So that last observation was really fascinating. I just wanted to point out, in Canadian copyright law, the Supreme Court said in CCH that fair use, fair dealing as it's called in Canada, is an essential strut in the edifice of copyright, and legal academics have held it with great enthusiasm. I'd be very surprised to find that in the actual application of the standard, it's any different than it's been in the US and falls afoul of the very concerns that you raise.
Last question by Brooke Thomas.
I find all this fascinating. One thing I want to do is I just want to push back on something here, which it seems a celebration of piracy. And I understand exactly why how important that is and the ideological realm behind it. And I'm going to do with one very quick, has nothing to do with copyright, and then another with copyright. We might want to remember that back in the era of the slave trade, Justice Story declared any slave trader a pirate for stealing property and so forth. But in terms of copyright, I'm going to go back to Joyce and Ulysses and Bakhtin. A number of literary critics, so the aesthetic side, you look at Ulysses, you read it, and you say, oh, this is an example of the dialogical, the Carnivalesque, and so forth. Readers get to create all these meanings. Joyce intended that, and so forth. And Joyce maybe would go along with that on the aesthetic side. But on the legal side, he wanted copyright because there were until he got copyright, there were all these pirated editions in which they were getting all the profits, also ruining his text by corrupting them. And so I think it's good to bring the aesthetic and the legal together, but Joyce himself had two very different, an aesthetic point of view of piracy, and he had then a legal point of view of piracy.
Well, there are two moments, right? One moment is the moment of creation. For example, Wordsworth did the same thing, right? He was involved in the French Revolution and a world iconoclast act, and then some in the 1850s he was arguing for eternal term to copyright because the people who could understand his poetry had to be not still affected by the conventions of his day.
International copyright.
And I want to be really clear here because I think in my verve for talking about how artificial the hierarchy is and saying it further marginalizes pirates and that may be a bad thing, I don't actually mean to endorse piracy in the sense that piracy can make it difficult for artists to make a living, and copyright exists. The whole raison d'etre is to give market access to people who would otherwise not be able to support themselves in creative endeavor. So I don't mean to imply that we should do away with copyright in any sense, but merely that we may want to think about what copyright as it currently exists is telling us about what work is. And that, so maybe that's why I'm left with a, what do we do about this problem?
So that brings us to the end of our session. Let's thank our panel again. We'll be out on a 15-minute break. Again, there should be some refreshments outside for those who are physically here. For those who are watching the webcast, we'll see you back here at a quarter after.